Thank you everyone for joining the first Oregon Kosher class in a while. Hold on, waiting for my computer to recognize me. Come on, open. There we go. Okay. So this is a two-part class. Tonight we're going to review some halachas. And tomorrow we'll get more hands-on. Rabbi Shank will be here to demonstrate how to wash different types of produce. But tonight, my intention here tonight is to review some of the halachas. And just as a way of an introduction, there's something out there I've noticed, a phenomenon out there. I'll call it checkophobia. Kind of like sometimes people have, hamotziaphobia and they don't want to eat bread, or they have, fleshikophobia, they don't want to be fleshik. There's something called checkophobia, where there are people who would rather just not deal with the checking of produce, and so they just don't eat vegetables that require checking, which is quite sad because, Hashem gave us these beautiful, vegetables to eat and be healthy, and we should, be comfortable washing and checking our produce. So the area of B'dikas Talayim, it is a complicated area in halacha. Part of that is because a lot of it is based on what we call mitzias, right? Meaning something could be considered more infested in one region versus another region. But as we see as we get into the halachas, that they're a little bit complex. And so the Kashrut agencies by default generally land on the more stringent side of things and are just trying to give information about this is the type of produce that needs to be checked and this is how you check it. So we're going to talk about today, there's going to be some things that surprise you, that may lead into potentially some leniencies. As a hakdama, as an introduction, I'll just say that I'm not paskening, and my recommendation is to always listen to the guidelines that are put out by the major kashrut agencies. My only intention in talking about some of these things is to remove some of the stigma so that people can feel comfortable that if they follow what the kashrut agencies say in terms of washing and checking your produce, that you shouldn't have to have checkophobia. And as long as you do your hishtadlus, as long as you do the best that you can, you don't have to worry about every single tiny speck of dirt that perhaps you're over in a deraisa of eating a bug. So there are a few surprises here. I'm going to go over here. First of all, not all bugs are awesome. That would be a big surprise. Some people might not know that. Most people may know about, there is a classification of grasshoppers or locusts that are kosher. But we'll also see that there are other bugs that may be technically not forbidden as well. Defining what a bug is also not so simple. And not all fruits and veggies need to be checked. That might not be such a big surprise, but we'll delve into either today or tomorrow why it is that we can. There's bugs on every fruit and vegetable in the world has had some encounter with a bug at some point in its existence. So we'll delve into a little bit, why is it that certain vegetables have to be washed and checked, and certain other vegetables, which also have had interactions with insects, why don't they have to be checked? This is not really working, I don't know why. Sorry, 1 second, I should have printed this out. Okay, here we go. And the last part that could be a surprise to some people is that most of our store-bought produce today, if you go into the store and you grab some produce, even the kind that the kashrut agencies say you have to check, from a Torah perspective, from a deraisa perspective, all of those vegetables you can pick up and you can eat without checking. That the checking requirement is actually a requirement of the rabbis. Doesn't make it any less important, but it's just to give the sense that right, Hashem, who created the world and who gave us the Torah, did not forbid. Nowhere in the Torah does it say romaine lettuce is, thou shalt not eat romaine lettuce, or raspberries, or Brussels sprouts, or broccoli, or any of those types of, types of produce that even today the kashrut agencies may say not to even bother with, like Brussels sprouts, raspberries, and things like that. But from a Torah perspective, all of those things are kosher. It's the bugs inside of them that aren't kosher, but from the perspective of Torah law, there's not generally a requirement to check produce before you eat it. We'll see that there is one category of produce where maybe there is a requirement if it's so infested, where it's known that every time you look at this fruit that it's going to have bugs crawling on it, then maybe perhaps there would be an issur. So the Torah talks about three types of insects. There's sheretz halaof, flying insects, sheretz alamayim, insects that are found in the water, and sheretz haaretz, which are insects that are found on the ground. Those are the three types of insects that the Torah talks about. And when it comes to flying insects, Pasuk tells us that gives us simonim and the names and classifications of 4 types of flying insects that are technically kosher. Most of us today don't have a masorah for what those bugs are. Typically some sort of locust or grasshopper. I guess if you're from Yemen, perhaps the Tamani Jews have some sort of masorah, and I have heard of people eating them. But generally speaking, for most of us, we don't know what those things are today. Similar to, say, fowl, right? There are certain types of poultry that the Torah lists 30 different types of birds or 20 different types of birds that are kosher, but we don't know what many of them are today, so we rely on whatever our masorah is. So it's sort of the same thing here. We don't have a clear masorah for what those bugs are, so generally speaking, you're not going to find those on the menu at JCC anytime soon. So water-based insects are actually interesting. So when you look at the psukim, when it comes to water-based insects, it talks about what's kosher in the water. So something that has kashkeses and spirum, right? That they have fins and they have scales. That is what's kosher in the water. And anything that doesn't have that in the water is not kosher. However, the Gemara talks about basically 3 different bodies of water. You have oceans and streams. These are bodies of water that have both a natural inlet and are continuously flowing. So anything found in the water, in that kind of water that does not have fins and scales, is basically a bug. I was actually at a bakery yesterday. I don't know, sometimes I go on inspections and you reach into new people and they always have interesting questions. So this person wanted to know why seafood wasn't kosher. So I said, from the perspective of the Torah, seafood is basically bugs of the water. They're not fish, halachically speaking. So if something is found in a body of water that is continuously flowing and has a natural inlet, not kosher. If a bug is found in a pit, in a puddle, something that does not have continuous motion and does not have a natural inlet of water, that bug is technically mutter until it leaves its habitat. So, not suggesting that you go looking for bugs in puddles and eat them, but the point is that there is a halachic technicality where that type of bug may actually not be forbidden until it leaves its habitat.
Does mutter mean?
What's that?
Does mutter mean?
Mutter means it's permitted, right? Asur is forbidden. Mutter means permitted. Thank you for any words that I say today. If you're not sure, please ask me for a definition. So, interestingly, so again, if we have anything that's in a sea or a stream is for sure forbidden. Anything that's found in a pit would not be forbidden unless it left the pit. Then we have bodies of water that are potentially have an inlet but are not continuously flowing, or don't have an inlet but are continuously flowing. And so there was a famous locust that came up, I guess this was probably in sometime in the 2000s, that somebody discovered that there were bugs in New York City water. These bugs are called copepods. And there was a whole to-do about filtering out your water, and big poskim on one side and big poskim on the other side. Some saying totally forbidden, these bugs are terrible and we need to filter them out, and others saying that no, that the reservoir from which these bugs come from are it may have a continuous inlet of water, some would say, but the water doesn't leave the reservoir unless somebody presses a button and opens the piping, so that it's not continued to be continuously in motion. So I only bring all of this up as just as an example of that not all bugs are considered the same. That here we have bugs that I've never found copepods in water. Some have suggested that our water system here in Oregon is similar to the water system in New York, in that it's a reservoir-based system and there's not filtration. Our water comes from the watershed, something like that. And I've been told that it's similar to the New York City water, and somebody asked a couple years ago about copepods, and we actually reached out to the Water Bureau, and didn't seem that their findings had any halakhic significance. But even still, many rabbis held that these bugs are not a problem, even if you can see them, because the water source from which they come is not considered to be both continuously flowing and have an actual inlet of water.
Can you briefly say
Yes.
why that matters?
So because again, so from the Pesukim in the Torah, it's clear that the Pesukim are talking about streams and oceans, things that have a natural inlet of water and are continuously in motion. And that's what the pasuk says. And if it doesn't have, so the Gemara in Chulin talks about, well, what if it's not in that kind of a body of water, right? So because the way the Gemara comes out, let's see if I have it here. Should I have it here? Yes. So the Gemara in Chulin says, where do we know that the Torah permits creatures found in the water of vessels? So this is talking about the third case, where you have the clear case is that streams and rivers and oceans. What if you find a bug in a cistern, in a pit, or something like that? So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, "This you may eat from everything in the water." So that means those creatures that are found in the seas and in the rivers, if they have fins and scales, you're allowed to eat them, and if they don't, you're not. While all of those found in the water of vessels, even if they don't have fins and scales, you're allowed to eat. So, there are discussions in the halacha about well water and things like that, and they definitely have more issues with bugs back then. But it seems that the Gemara understands that the way the Pesukim lay out is that for sure bugs that are found in bodies of water that are not have the technical definition of a sea or a river are not forbidden from the Torah. So then again, yeah.
I just want to clarify that, if you don't
Yes.
mind. So just to understand this a little bit better for me, are there any times that Rabbanim have created more restrictions than the Torah? Like I know for Shabbos.
Well, for sure, there's fences, right? Of
Right, like
course.
as a fence,
Of
exactly.
course. So that's why, right? That's why we have a rabbinic obligation to check certain produce when the produce is at a certain level of infestation, because the rabbi said, even though technically speaking, maybe you'd have what to rely on to eat that piece of lettuce without checking it, but because there are several times throughout the Torah, right, where bugs have this particular, they're an abomination, right? The Torah uses a very strong word that eating bugs are completely, anti what a Jew is about, right? That there's a concept in Torah of timtum alev, that by eating non-kosher food that we are spiritually, deadening ourselves, and bugs particularly have that status of being something that's disgusting, and therefore the rabbis enacted, an obligation to check certain produce because we want to stay away from potentially eating bugs, even if the I ate that bug, what we call ba'inus, right? I ate it not willfully. I didn't take a bug and put it in my mouth and eat it. Which, by the way, if you work in a restaurant and you show the non-Jewish chef the bugs on produce, that's what they'll do. I've heard, we had it in our own kitchen, like, oh, look, just to show them, just to prove, and then, and eat it. Just to prove to us that they don't care.
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question. The question was, don't we see that there are, that the rabbis, right, we see in several areas, halakha, Shabbos, and whatnot, that the rabbis do enact fences to keep us from the Issur D'Oraisa, right? So, but at least here, when we're talking about water-based bugs, it seems that the technicality here is that bugs that are found in a vessel, and we'll see later why they hold this way, but that bug, from the perspective of the rabbis, is that bug originated in the vessel. It didn't come from outside someplace else. It originated in that vessel, and therefore, I know scientifically, I get it, and we'll get there. But yeah, so that's just and I don't want to belabor the point, but the point here is just that there are, just to put out that there are bugs that are, not all bugs are necessarily usher or have the same degree of prohibition than other bugs. The third category of bugs is Sheretz al-Aretz. Those are bugs that are found on the ground, which is probably most of the bugs that we're mainly familiar with. And sheet here. So there's two interesting things there that the rabbis discover about land-based insects. So a land-based insect, according to the Torah, is only usher once they have actually crawled on the ground. It's called the sheretz ala aretz. So until it has actually crawled on the ground, it is not a forbidden bug. So that would mean, for instance, if there was a bug that was born inside of a fruit, let's just say, born inside the actual fruit, and then that fruit is detached from the ground. Back up. The fruit is detached from the ground, and then the bug is sort of born inside the fruit that's detached from the ground. As long as that bug never left the fruit and crawled on the ground, then technically speaking, it's not forbidden. It hasn't crawled on the ground. A sheretz is something that crawls on the ground, and in this case, this didn't crawl on the ground yet. So one place where that came up, there was in 2009, I believe, which, by the way, I just want to, if you're interested in a book, this is a great book. This is Rav David Cohen from the CRC. A lot of what I'm talking about tonight comes from his book, and if you're interested, I could send you a link to it. But it's it's a halakhic work, and he goes over, he takes the halakha and then brings it down to cases that'll come up in the modern day. So one such case has to do with raisins. Apparently in 2009, there was discovered a certain type of bug in raisins called a Drosophila larvae. So apparently the nature of this bug is that what's that?
Common fruit.
Well, right. I hesitate to use the word fly because we're talking about bugs that are considered bugs of the ground.
Oh.
Flying bugs are different. But apparently this bug, its method is that they are only found in grapes once they have been detached from the vine and begin to dry out. And they were finding these bugs in raisins. So turns out many poskim held that these bugs are not a problem because the fruit was already detached from the ground and the bug did not. When I say born in the fruit, we can say it didn't come into existence, so to speak. It was not visible to the eye until the fruit is already detached from the ground. So that's just an example where, a modern day example. Now, it doesn't mean, for instance, that if you see that bug that you can just eat it. There still may be a rabbinic prohibition because it's a disgusting thing for you to actually take the bug and eat it. But the point is, do you have to check raisins for bug infestation? So many poskim held that you don't, because these bugs are not really an issue. So you don't have to check them.
So I don't
Yeah.
interrupt you. I mean, okay, so like for apples around here, they all have codling moths in them. I mean, codling, if you don't really spray your apples.
Right.
So I mean, if you kick them really early, you can't really see anything in there.
Right.
But there probably are some eggs in there. But
So eggs are not a problem. I had an issue in my house last week. My kids were yelling for pancakes, and we found some old box of pancake mix in the cupboard, and I started to pour it out into a measuring cup, and there were little worms, and the worms didn't move, and then I waited 10 seconds, and they started moving. So who knows how long those worms have been sitting in there. But does that mean that I need to check my pancake mix? No, these are storage pests. Not to gross you out.
Could you repeat?
Yeah, the question was bugs that you can't see, right? You know they're there,
You know they're there.
or they're microscopic, or they're in egg form, or whatever it might be. So the point I'm making is that all flour has bugs. But they're not bugs that you can see. They're not bugs that are at a stage yet where they are forbidden. But if you don't store your flour well, eventually those eggs can germinate and hatch, and then you open your bag of flour and all these weevils come flying out. Where did they come from? The bag was closed. Right? Obviously they didn't fly from someplace else and worm their way into the bag. They were there the whole time. You just couldn't see them, and they weren't usher then. And then, because it wasn't stored properly, it becomes a problem. Yes?
So why is it like the custom, that's the English word, for in America we don't sift flour,
Correct.
but in Israel they do?
I've never lived in Israel, so I can't really speak for what they do in Israel, but my understanding is that the question again was, why in Israel do they drive themselves nuts sifting flour and all of these other things that we don't do in America and in other countries? Now, again, we have to understand that, right, bugs like certain climates more than others, right? So it could be that maybe there are more infestation issues in areas of the world that have hotter climates. We happen to live in a very temperate climate here, which is good for bugs, meaning good for us in that we don't, in fact, I'm on a kosher WhatsApp group, and there's a rabbi from Dallas who's always posting pictures of bugs, and I'm like, I don't know where you find all these bugs. We don't have such issues. So to your point also, like sometimes the Kashrut agencies will send out an alert that says, blueberries, you have to check blueberries. Right, so every June, July comes around, and Oregon blueberry season starts here, and I get all kinds of questions. I have not found Oregon blueberries to be problematic.
I think the issue in Israel is that Pesach time, the mills stop for a week, and so during that time,
Yeah.
be like infestation.
Infestation, or again, again, these are storage pests, a lot of them. So it's like, if you're in a hotter climate, and yes.
Two things. Number one, your wife writes.
Repeat the question, Tuvia.
Israel is pre-sifted.
Okay.
Here it's, vice versa. Here's pre-sifted in Israel, it's not.
Could be.
Repeat that, and
Right.
you'll get that in a minute. Also, Berkowitz did say that, he said, like, it's true, there's no issue in Israel, but since, because the climate, they're afraid it's going to come back.
Right.
So they make them just.
They make them do it anyway.
So you
Right.
get people.
Yeah, so two things there, right? One is that apparently in America we're spoiled and we get all our flour pre-sifted, and in Israel you don't. That could be that could be part of the reason, and again, because they're storage pests, so there could be more potential issues that they're not as common here. At any rate, that's just an example where you have land-based insects that could technically be mutter. Another example is if you've ever looked at your green scallions, green onions, leeks. Sometimes you can see these little trails that work their way through so those are called leaf miners. So leaf miners are an interesting bug. They lay their eggs inside the folds and leaf of the vegetable, and at that point they're not even visible. They're microscopic, practically. And then they grow inside and they burrow their way out. So most times, if you see that trail, most of the time you can assume that it grew to a point and it's not there anymore. Today, my friend in Dallas posted a picture of a leaf miner that he found by cutting. So some people suggest when for checking scallions and green onions to take a knife on the bottom vertically and open a few, because that's what they do. They crawl through the bottom, I guess. I've never found, here in Oregon, I've never found a leaf miner, a live leaf miner inside of a scallion or green onion or leek. And again, because this is something that it's born inside of the vegetable and has never crawled outside of the vegetable. So there are those who would say that perhaps this is an example of a land-based insect that's not technically forbidden. And so many kashrut agencies do not require checking these things. Some do. It's just since you can see the leaf miner trail, it doesn't hurt to check a few just to rule it out. But
Well, shouldn't you check it if you can't see the trail? If you can see the trail, you say they're not there.
right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's the the joke is, what's worse than finding a worm, an apple with a worm in it, finding an apple with a half a worm in it, right? So, but generally speaking, once they've burrowed their way out, they're not generally there. But again, yeah.
Is it, you talked about land-based insects.
Yes, this is a
So
land-based.
Codling moth is not a land-based.
Right, it's a flying insect. So
Yeah, that's
right,
different. That's different. Okay.
yeah. So no, these are insects that crawl on the ground. They don't have wings. They don't fly.
You said before that this is only if it's detached from the ground.
Right. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that
If it's on, if
one,
it's still connected, like if it's growing, what does it mean attached to the ground? It's
Oh,
still on the plant?
right,
The plant's
right. So what it means by attached to the ground is that it's still on the plant.
So how do you know?
Good question. Right. So there's actually a fascinating bug known as the citrus scale. So the citrus scale is something that if you're looking at an orange, you'll probably likely only see it as a black dot. Because what the citrus scale does is when it's some say you can't even see it at this point. There are others that say you can. I think Shmir Shabbos Kalkasa talks about it. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach talks about it because it's more common in Israel, I guess. But the Shulchan Aruch says that if you have a fruit that's attached to the ground, but there's a bug there, that bug is so wedged that it probably never moved. And that's what happens with citrus scales. They're very, very small, and you can't see them when they're crawling, for the most part. That's my understanding. There's a bit of a machlokas about whether you can see them or not, but we'll go with assuming that you can see them. And then they inject their, whatever you call it, I don't know the technical term for it, but they inject something into the fruit, and then a wax covering covers over it, and then it's it. It's done. That's its whole life. So there are those who say that the citrus scale is not a problem because the Shulchan Aruch says that even though the fruit is attached to the ground, the bug came into existence in a place where it's so wedged that it never moved. So it's attached to the ground, but it never crawled on the ground. Whereas the other thing, what I was saying about the raisins, is that if the bug is born in the fruit once it's already detached from the ground, as long as it never left its habitat and crawled on the ground, then it's technically mutter. Yes?
Because you will get it. Let's say something's hydroponically grown. Right?
I'm getting to my next point. You're right ahead of me.
Because let's say you have, there's a lot of, today there's a lot of vertical farms, you can buy even romaine lettuce and other vegetables. So if you find an animal crawling on it, but because it's not on the ground, and, depending on what's grown in, of course, it might not be considered even hadama.
Right.
And
Yes.
be a speck.
Yes. If you don't know, Sarah Medina is a budding microgreen farmer. She has a whole microgreen farm in her house in New York or New Jersey. Is that New Jersey? New York. So Sarah Medina's question was, what about bugs that are grown, that are found on plants that are not considered ever attached to the ground. So there are two types of produce that are discussed when we talk about something that's grown in a way that's she'enu nukav. It's not grown attached to the ground. One is mushrooms. The Gemara talks about how mushrooms do not get their nutrition from the ground.
It's very important. Right?
Yeah. So there's discussion in the poskim about whether that applies over by bugs as well. To say that bugs that are found in mushrooms are not a problem because mushrooms do not get their nutrition from the ground, so they're not considered from the ground. That aside, most mushrooms that you find in the store today are actually grown in mushroom farms that are grown indoors. And they're not necessarily grown on soil. Same thing with hydroponics, right? They're not grown in soil. So there are those who want to posit that by mushrooms, that generally speaking, now generally mushrooms are not a problem. There are only a few types of mushrooms that even the Kashrut agencies that have done a lot of research and a lot of data collecting and washing and checking mushrooms, I think it's only oyster mushrooms and maybe one other one. But oyster mushrooms, I guess, apparently are known to have mites in them, and
Portobello, the big ones, right?
right, the ones with the fan. I don't eat mushrooms, so I don't know mushrooms so well. But there are poskim who posit that bugs in mushrooms are not a problem today because most of the mushrooms that you find in the store are not grown out in the fields. Unless you're going foraging in the Oregon forest, which people do. But the mushrooms that you buy in the store are generally grown indoors in controlled environments, so you're not likely to find bugs. And the bugs you do find potentially are not usser because the mushrooms are not grown in a way that's considered halakhically attached to the ground. Same thing with hydroponics, right? The different types of media that are used for hydroponics, whether it be the coconut shell or other types of things that they use, it's not considered soil, and they're not considered to be grown attached to the ground. So there could be that hydroponic vegetables have a lesser obligation to check.
So what about like the butter lettuce that's like
That grows in that's the living lettuce, that they call it. I've checked that lettuce before and I've actually never found bugs in it. So again, I guess it'd be a question of whether that's considered, because not all hydroponics are the same. Like some hydroponics, actually say not all greenhouse grown things are the same, right? 'Cause some greenhouse things are grown in a greenhouse and then they're brought outside to be packaged. So there have been cases where it's like, greenhouse grown, hydroponic, but then they bring it outside and they're out there packaging it outside and there are bugs flying around. So why would they do that? Just to throw us off our game, I guess. But there is a discussion about hydroponics and things that are grown indoors and things that are not soil based. And again, these are just examples to give you just the notion that not all bugs are created and are considered equal in the eyes of halacha, and that they're so hopefully that will help you a little bit in not being having checophobia, as I called it. The next thing I'd like to talk about, now that we've gone through the three categories of bugs, and we've seen that besides flying bugs, within water-based bugs and within land-based bugs, there are potential reasons why not all of those bugs would be considered uncertain. The next question that comes to the forefront is, what is a bug in terms of when I look at a piece of lettuce and I see something and I'm not sure, is that a bug or is that not a bug? Right? That's the common occurrence. Right? Things that are obviously bugs, we can say, okay, I can see that that's a bug. Right? Much of the produce we get in the store, we can wash it and check it and not be sure if what I'm looking at is a bug or not a bug. So in halacha, in order for a bug to be considered a bug, it has to be nir l'anayim. It has to be something that's visible to the eye. Right? So certainly anything of a microscopic nature is not halachically a bug. So obviously bacteria, viruses, whatever other microscopic bugs are floating around us, those are not a problem. or even take something, you know, where you can see fermentation happening, right? It's a bacteria that's growing, or you can see the effect that's happening, but you don't actually see the actual bug in its form. So that's considered also to be microscopic in nature and is not usher. Then on the opposite side of the scale are the bugs that we can see. We see them flying around. We can see that they have wings. We can see appendages. We can see, you know, those are obviously the bugs that are usher. But there's this middle category where what if a bug can be seen? I mean, you can see it. You see the dot. You see a black dot, but you can't identify it as a bug unless you magnify it. Is that considered nir l'nayim? Is that considered something that I can see? It's not microscopic. I can see it, but in its present form, I can't tell whether it's a bug or not. Oftentimes what can happen if you're washing produce and you're washing a lot of produce, and if you're using thrift cloths and light boxes and you're pouring the water through a strainer, right, what you wind up with is a bunch of flattened bugs that may be missing appendages or whatnot, and maybe it's crushed to a point where you can't identify it. Is that considered nir l'nayim? So there is, of course, a big machlokas in the poskim.
What is Neil Anayim?
Visible to the naked eye.
Neil?
Nira. You can see it l'nayim with the naked eye. You can see it with your eye. So what does that mean? So there are actually two questions that come up. The one question is, like I mentioned, that if I can see it, but I can't identify it as a bug. The other question that comes up is, whose eyesight are we going by? Right? So typically in most halakhic things that have to do with you're going by the average person. But there seems to be a trend now where mashkikim are being highly skilled, trained with magnification. Why are kashrut agencies using magnifying glasses? Why are mashkikim using jeweler's loops, not just to check their esrogim, but to check for bugs? So there are those who say that it's for training purposes. I'm training my eye, not that I need the magnification. Nobody says in halacha that I need magnification. If I can only see it through magnification, it's not usher. Everyone agrees with that. The question is, can I use magnification to train my eye to be able to identify those things that to the normal person it looks like a black dot, but because I've spent hours with my magnifying glass and I know this type of produce gets this type of bug and it presents itself as just a black dot, so I know that that's a bug. Is that called nir l'nayim? Is that called something that the average person can see? Because that would mean that none of you are allowed to check your own produce unless you've spent hours and hours with a magnifying glass checking your produce. So therefore you have to call 1-800 bug checkers, and they have to come to your house every Friday morning or Thursday night and check your lettuce for you because you're not capable of checking it. You're not allowed to check it. That's obviously not true. So there are discussions in the poskim as far as that's concerned. Whose eyesight? The average person's eyesight. And that could be very subjective. I know a rabbi a big rabbi in a kashrut organization. He's one of the heads of a kashrut organization. He said he doesn't check bugs. He doesn't check. He has other people check because he knows that he doesn't trust himself because he's not sure what he's looking at. But we're going to see that approach doesn't necessarily have to be how we approach things, because there are two opinions with everything, and I'm going to go over those right now. So one school of thought, this is Rabbi Elyashiv, the Feivel Cohn, who just passed away recently, the Chazon Ish, the Vai. They are of the opinion that if a bug is visible, even if it can't be identified except by taking a much closer look, that the bug is still usher. And the only bugs that are permitted are actual microscopic bugs. Once I can see it with my eye, then it's forbidden and it's usher. The other school of thought is that once a bug is no longer identifiable, then it no longer has the status of a bug and it actually loses its forbidden status. The logic here is that microscopic bugs are permitted because Hashem does not expect us to see things and know things that are beyond our human capabilities. We usually say this with the phrase, right? Hashem did not create us to be angels. We're not angels. We're not malachim. And so the Torah does not forbid things that require more than human capabilities to avoid. Furthermore, the school of thought here is that Hashem, who decides which bugs are permitted, wouldn't put us in a position to always be, wouldn't put us in a position where we're always potentially eating bugs that we can't recognize. Right? Because a lot of the times that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with bugs that we can't see or we can't identify as bugs. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have to take some effort. And there's a lot of information out there now in the Kashrut agencies of how to identify a bug and what they look like and the types of bugs that are common on certain types of produce. And it's you have to be educated, but you don't have to take out your magnifying glass to see if it's an actual bug. Yeah.
Who are the brand names on this side of the debate?
Rabelsky, Rav Schachter, Rav Chaim Ozer, Rav Vosner, and Rav Gissinger, who was one of the Dayam in the Kaf-K, passed away, I think, last year, 2 years ago. And those were the people on the, we'll call it the Makel side, I guess, that once a bug is not able to be identified as a bug, even though I can see it as a black dot or a green dot or whatever it might be, that it's not, it may have started out as a forbidden bug. But now that it's at a point where I can't recognize it, this school of thought is that it actually becomes permitted. In the same way, when we have in halakha, we have nullification, right? That when something becomes nullified, does that mean that, well, it's still there, only I'm permitted to eat it? Or does it actually become permitted entirely? Yeah.
So my understanding is that if you are pureeing fruit or
Yes.
veggies, you don't have to check it because any bugs would become.
That's correct, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Smoothies, making smoothies, making jams and jellies, things like that. So, and I will get to that. But just in terms of from my perspective, anyway, and Rav Cohn talks about in his book that basically he breaks down bugs into 5 categories: ones that are identifiable to everyone, ones that may be only identifiable once they're alive and moving. For instance, if you've ever checked strawberries, right? Strawberries are full of black dots, and the worms actually kind of look like the black dots on the strawberry. That you might not even notice that they're there unless they're moving. So bugs that are only identifiable if they're alive and moving are also considered to be asur. And bugs that are microscopic are totally permitted. He breaks it down there. What he says: identifiable bugs that can be identified through training one's eyes through magnification. And then there are bugs that you can see the mark, but you can't identify it as a bug. You don't see appendages, you don't see wings, you don't see legs, you don't see anything that would be the identifying features of a bug, but you do see the black dot, right? So I bring this up because that's a common occurrence. And although I said I wouldn't paskin, I'm not paskining, but if you're checking something and all you see are a bunch of black dots or things that you can't tell if it's a speck of dirt or a bug, I don't think that you have to worry that that's a bug. Yes?
A common problem, actually, Napa cabbage, like the Asian cabbage.
Yeah, it has on the
many
bottom.
times has all these little black dots.
Yes.
So I just.
Those are not bugs.
Really?
They're not bugs.
Thanks,
Yeah. I happen to know that there's no because I've looked into it before, and apparently there's something with that I forget what they call it. If you Google it, there's a certain term for those.
Rust or something?
Yeah, it's like something like that. It's like, but those are not bugs. Yes.
Okay, so I have a question. If we have 2 different sides of this debate
Yes.
on whether or not those bugs should be counted as bugs, where do you, or maybe you'll be getting to this anyway, but for the average person like me, how do I know what other people are, like, what's the standard?
Right. So the standard is what the Kashrut agencies recommend for how you should check, right? But in terms of you're checking something and you're not sure if something's a bug or not, and that's all you're finding are those types of things, I'm not saying that you can just go ahead and pick up that speck of dirt and eat it, right? But what I'm saying is that when we're talking about whether a produce is infested to a point where, again, the point is that there's not an isser to eat the vegetable, right? There's a rabbinic prohibition to check the vegetable. Once you check the vegetable, then you're sort of in the clear. And so if all you're finding are specks of dirt, then I wouldn't say that it would be an indication of an infestation of that vegetable, and you could prepare it.
According to everyone?
I mean, according to the school of thought that would hold that is not a forbidden bug to begin with, right? It's not forbidden anymore because you can't recognize it as a bug. So according to that school of thought, and if you combine that with the fact that most produce that we buy today, which we should know, right, there's not 100% that there's bugs in there. It's a suffix. It's a doubt. Right? You buy any produce in the supermarket, there's a doubt whether there's a bug or bugs in there or not. Because I was skipping ahead a little bit, but there are basically 3 categories of produce. There's what we call muksik, which means that 51% or more of the time you're going to see bugs in any given leaf or floret of that vegetable. Anything below that is mutter is permitted from a Torah perspective to eat without any issue. If it's muksik, if I pick up an apple off the tree and I see moths flying all around it and inside of it, yeah, I can't just say, well, apples don't usually have bugs and eat it, right? I see the bugs, I see that they're there, and I see they're crawling all over the place. That's a problem. The produce that we buy in the store, unless you're getting from like imperfect produce or something like that, which has its own issues, but most store-bought produce has already been picked over, right? I was watching a documentary about food waste, and it's like, what makes it into the store is, for the most part, your top line produce, right? The stores don't want to sell produce that is crawling with bugs, that looks bad, that has, holes in it, or whatnot. Yeah, you had a question.
What about like pre-packaged, pre-washed salad?
Great question. Pre-washed lettuce. So certainly I would say depends on the produce that we're talking about. But I was just at a conference in July, and one of the rabbis from the Star K gave a whole presentation on triple washed lettuce. Unfortunately, not all triple washed lettuce is, not all systems that companies use. There's different types of systems, and not all of them are effective. And sometimes what you have is basically you're washing lettuce in buggy water. Like, great, it was triple washed, but they're recycling the water. They're not filtering out the bugs enough. That their acceptable ratio of bugs is far, what they allow is far above what we would allow from a halakhic standpoint. So most triple washed lettuce, unless it has a good kosher symbol on it, and there are some out there on lettuces that are not considered acceptable. So I won't speak about symbols. Rabbi Rimmer's going to speak about symbols at some point, but yeah. So I would say that we get a lot of triple wash lettuce at the JCC, and we always wash and check it, and we do sometimes find bugs. So, yeah.
Wouldn't it be arguable to say that after that happens, a lot of the bugs that do end up get destroyed in the process of this 3 triple and the destruction of whatever?
Right.
That anything that does end up on it, are they whole or are they?
So right. So I think one of the things that I think you're touching upon is there's a concept in halacha known as a beria, right? That the only bug that is actually usher, but a beria is a whole bug, and whole bugs are not they're not nullified. So meaning if a whole bug falls into a big pot of soup, right, you have to actually strain out the soup to find that whole bug, assuming that it's still whole, right? Once it's not whole anymore, not whole can mean it's missing one appendage, one part of its wing, whatever it might be, and it's not considered whole anymore. So then it can be nullified, and bugs are obviously very small in comparison to the produce that they're found inside of. And so, to your point, right? Yeah, after it goes through that triple washing, it could be that they're not full bugs anymore. It'd be the same thing by frozen produce, right? Frozen strawberries, frozen raspberries, things like that. There are those who posit that any bugs that you would find in there are not going to be whole bugs, that they're generally going to break apart in the process. So to get to Miriam's question about smoothies, right? So that's one of the reasons why, potentially one of the reasons why you're allowed to take certain produce and put it into a smoothie, make a jam, something like that, where there's two things happening, right? The produce itself, again, you have there's a prohibition against nullifying something. We call it ein mevatlan isur l'chachila. You're not allowed to. I can't just say, oh, you know what? I feel like eating bacon today, so I'm going to take my bacon and I'm going to throw it into my soup because it's going to be 1/60th of my soup, and you're not allowed to do that, right? But the produce that say that you want to make a smoothie out of, right, you're looking at this particular piece of produce. You don't know if there's a bug in there or not. There could be a bug. There also could be no bugs in there, right? We check lettuce, we check romaine lettuce. Sometimes we find no bugs. Sometimes we find a lot of bugs. So it's a second category. But I said there's a category that's 51%. That's considered a muksik. The category where we have to check is miyad hamatzai. It's that 10% of the time I'm going to find a bug in this produce. That level is where the rabbis give an obligation to check produce. But I still have a doubt whether there's a bug in there. It's not for sure. And so let's say I want to make a smoothie. Now, sometimes I get a call and someone says, I accidentally bought, or somebody gave me, somebody went to the U-Pick and they brought me, all these, raspberries. Rabbi, what do I do? Can I just throw it in the smoothie? So if it was at a point where we consider it to be muksik, meaning it's covered in bugs, then no, you can't do that. If it's at a point where there's a doubt whether there's bugs, which most produce there is that doubt, so then it depends. There are some poskim who would say there's no issue of ein mevatlan isur because your kavana is not to, you're not trying to mevatel the bugs. You're trying to make a smoothie or make a jam. The classic case that's brought in the poskim in the Shulchan Aruch has to do with honey. You're allowed to heat honey, even though by doing so the little bug parts are going to melt into the honey. So there's a medieval commentator, Taz, who he's really the source for this, is that it's not a problem because your kavana is just to fix the honey. All you're doing is warming up the honey in order to make it flowable, to make it edible, whatever it might be. You don't really care. You're not trying to nullify the bugs. There's another school of thought that says you have to go one step further. You have to do something to the produce to show that your intention is not. So generally speaking, that would just be washing. So if somebody says, I have all these raspberries and I want to make a jam. So do something to show that you're trying to get rid of the bugs. Wash them, because who cares what they look like at that point, right? Because you're going to be mashing them up anyway. So it's not like we're trying to, make them presentable in some way. We've always had this issue with the JCC with strawberries, because, and they stopped using strawberries because they got mad at us. Because once you wash them to a certain point and then you dip them in chocolate, the chocolate doesn't like to stay on the strawberry anymore. Do frozen fruits and vegetables need to be checked? So generally speaking, not. For two reasons. One is maybe they're not possible to check. How do you check a frozen vegetable? Are you supposed to defrost it and then check it? It's very difficult to do that. So I would say most fruits and vegetables that are in the category, again, the third category is something that's called einu matsui, that there's not enough infestation level that there's not even a requirement to check. So those are things like carrots, zucchini, tomatoes. And there's a whole list. You can go on the Kashrut agency's websites and they'll tell you what is and what isn't. It's not that those things don't have any bugs. It's just that the rabbis didn't put an obligation. Again, this is important, right? The produce itself is not forbidden. There's no produce in the world except if it's like a Shemitah year, it's coming from Israel or whatever, any of those, but there's no produce in the world that the Torah forbids. It's only the bugs that are forbidden. And so the rabbis said if there's a certain level of infestation, then you have to check it. But once you've done your hishtadlus and you've checked your produce, and if there's things there that you're not sure, you can't tell the difference between a speck of dirt and a bug, I don't think you have to drive yourself crazy about it. And you've done your hishtadlus. And at that point, if you accidentally eat a bug, okay, it doesn't have an effect. It's a different question, and more of a hashkafic question. Is there a timtum alev if I unknowingly eat a bug? Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, you speak to your local Orthodox rabbi, I guess. Timtum alev. It's how would you describe that? Deadening of the heart, a blocking of the heart. Maybe timtum is really to block, right? It's it really means that, right? That spiritually, there's something. Anytime we eat non-kosher food, right? We're an Am Kadosh, and that's why we eat kosher food. Is that we're trying to connect to holiness, and eating things that are forbidden from the Torah is separates us, and so bugs would be any non-kosher food would have that effect. Yeah.
Not to ask specifics, but so you mentioned, let's say, like a frozen fruit, right? So let's say CRC policies, like blueberries that are frozen don't need to be checked.
Right.
But let's say if they're fresh, then they do need to be rinsed. So you just said, though, if it does need to be cleaned on a regular basis, then you should be more careful. So what is happening when you go from, let's say, a fresh vegetable to a frozen vegetable? And what is the ruling of just like frozen fruits and vegetables?
Right.
Do they need hashkafas on them?
Good, great question. So there is definitely something happening in the process, right? And once the produce is processed in some way, that's going to have some effect on its infestation level. So in the freezing process, in the freezing of produce, there are two different types of freezing. There's freezing where you actually put it in a freezer, right? And then there's something called IQF, which is individually quick frozen, which means that each strawberry, raspberry, whatever it is coming down the line, and after it's been washed and gone through a couple different steps, it's blasted with liquid nitrogen. For the most part, there are those who want to say that frozen bugs are just as usher as non-frozen bugs, but there's a question of that freezing, those bugs, even if they're frozen solid in a solid state, if you were to touch them, they would just fall apart to dirt or dust. So there are those who say that those bugs are not usher at that point because they don't have any more. There's nothing left, right? For instance, freeze drying is another. So it's very more somewhat common way that is freeze drying. It's the way the freeze drying works. Anytime you cook fruit, right, it changes its health properties. So freeze drying is a way that the companies came up with where it's preserved and the original nutrients in the fruit are not broken down because it's not cooked. The way they freeze dry fruit is you take frozen fruit and then you put it through a process that dries it up. Any bugs that would survive that process are not forbidden because they're basically not really bugs at that point. They may look like a bug, but once you touch it, it has a status. In halakha, there's an idea of bugs that are over 12 months old are not considered to be dried out to the point that they're just dirt and dust and don't have any juice left in them, I guess. So with frozen fruits and vegetables, the ones that don't require checking in their raw state wouldn't require checking in their frozen state either. We're talking about things like strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, things that in their fresh state may require checking. What happens at the freezing point there where maybe they won't require checking? So one school of thought is that if something is not able to be checked, then how could the rabbis require us to check something that's not able to be checked? What's that?
Like milk.
What do you mean?
You can't drink milk from a cow that's sick.
Right.
Right, but if you don't know it's sick, then
right. Well, there we're relying on a rove.
Right.
In a behemoths, that most behemoths are not. Rove behemoths and treifas, that they're not considered treif, because we don't know. Because we have a chazaka that an animal is kosher unless we have a reason to take it out of its chazaka. But here, they may not be. I'll give you an example. Raspberries, fresh raspberries. How do you check fresh raspberries? How do you check them?
You don't.
So apparently they've done some studies, and apparently there's something they call the drop test, where if you drop the raspberry from a certain height onto a white paper plate, all the bugs will come scurrying out. So there's a question: is that what the rabbis required when they said to check? Did they require us to go to such efforts? Another example, there's been nobody knows about it, it's more on a Kashrut chat, but there's been people who are in coconut sugar. They find bugs in coconut sugar. So how do they check the coconut sugar? These are usually hamish hashkagas, but they say you have to boil the sugar until it goes back into its coconut sap stage, then pour it through a filter, and then check the filter. Seems, so again, there's a limit to what is required in order to check something, right? And again, and the reason is because we have a doubt of whether there's a bug in there. There's no question that if you know a bug flew into your soup, then you need to filter it out. If you would try to find the bug and pull it out, right? But here we're talking about stuff that there's a doubt whether there's bugs in there to begin with, and there's a rabbinic obligation to check it. But how far do I have to go? So can frozen produce be checked? Frozen spinach, can it be checked? Probably not. Now the question would be: is there an obligation as a kosher consumer to say, well, but it should have been checked when it was fresh, and let's say this less than reputable hashkaka agency decided, well, it's going to be frozen anyway, so they're not going to check. So they got around the checking requirement. But what does that mean for me as the kosher consumer? So some would say that spinach, since if you're going to be eating it whole, that you should only buy spinach that has or broccoli or things like that have a proper good hashkacha, because the kashrut agency that may be on it gave hashkacha to it without fulfilling the rabbinic obligation to check it when it was in its fresh stage. If you're pureeing it, though, certainly if you're pureeing, making smoothies, things like that, I would recommend frozen produce over fresh produce, because a process has already been done to it to lessen the amount of potential bugs that would be in there. Yeah.
what's considered whole? Because when you buy frozen spinach, it's not whole already; it's already some type of mush, and
Right.
the floret's already cut. So what's considered whole?
No, a floret. I mean, the floret is whole.
That's
You can see.
considered
Yeah,
whole.
it's considered
Let's
whole.
say like zucchinis and some other fruits are like cuts, and like mangoes cut.
So those don't really need, but say strawberries,
Mhm.
right? Strawberries, frozen is a whole strawberry, right? So I don't think it's possible to check frozen strawberries. So some kashrut agencies say that you can use them for pureeing. Apparently, and I learned this not too long ago, if there's an OU on a bag of frozen strawberries, that means the OU says that you can eat them whole. No problem. Yes, another question.
So when the CRC says like the blueberry is frozen or
Yeah.
good, do they mean only if I'm planning to mush it?
No, but blueberries.
What does it mean?
See, that's why this
I like
whole
total
area is so
fish
confusing,
straight.
because right. So they're, if they meant that, they would say for pureeing purposes only. So they're saying that these blueberries in their fresh stage, maybe they feel they should be checked. Once they've been frozen, the freezing process has mitigated the bug issue in the produce. So that and that's again, blueberries is one example, but a lot of this is based on location. How far you are from the source. For instance, if for instance strawberries, right? If we're getting strawberries from California, they're sitting on a truck for way less time than they are if they're shipping them to New York, right? So so infestation levels change depending on the location. So it's hard when all the kashrut agencies are as go from my wife. Okay, ask this question.
And also you look at the
When all these kashrut agencies are based on the East Coast or the Midwest, so they're reporting what they see, but it's not always the same here. Doesn't freezing break up the bugs into parts? Maybe wrap it up and save Q&A till the end. I wasn't supposed to read that part. This is the end.
No, I wrote that.
Oh, you wrote that part. This is the end. Because we have a second part next tomorrow. So again, the freezing process would break up the bugs to a point where they're not considered whole.
So, wrapping up, just
Yes.
at home when we're checking our
Yeah.
produce, do you have any feelings as far as how, do we have to buy light boxes? Or just
So great
rely
question.
on
Great
our
question.
eyes?
So that is the trendy thing to do now, and all the kashrut agencies recommend. The question was, is a light box and a throat cloth required? The Oregon Kosher's policy is that it's not. We allow our mishkikim to use it if they choose, but if mishkiach finds that they can just look at the water, or people like to do different things. I get Pesach, before Pesach, I get calls like, I don't want to wash everything. Can I just literally check leaf by leaf? There's no halakhic obligation to wash, right? And there's very few discussions in Shulchan Aruch about halakhically required ways to check. There's an obligation to check. So the kashrut agencies have found over the course of 20, 30 years, right? Whatever it is when we stopped spraying DDT, because that seems to be, there was the error before DDT and the error after DDT. Apparently before DDT, and many Jewish homes, they didn't know anything about checking because everything was dead. Okay, they were eating other DDT. Obviously which in hindsight was not a good idea, but
DDT for the rest
it was some sort of pesticide that apparently was pretty effective at taking all produce and making sure that it was either bug free or at least to the point where there was not an obligation to check. So post when they found that they were giving everybody cancer, unfortunately, they stopped spraying DDT, and so the kashrut just fell at that point, right? There seemed to be more incidences of bugs, and so over the course of 20, 30 years of different washing, who came up with the idea of washing with soap, right? Or vegetable wash, right? They used to talk about people soaking their vegetables in salt water. Apparently, it's not very effective. The idea behind say soap or vegetable washes or things like that is that certain bugs, particularly thrips and aphids, apparently they have grabbers, and they don't come off of the produce just by simply washing it off. So produce that may have worms or other types of bugs that are easily washed off are different than, say, romaine lettuce and other greens, which tend to have these bugs that tend to latch on. And so the idea of using soap, dish soap, or a vegetable wash, if that's what you prefer to use, is that they call it a surfactant. It's something that loosens their grip, apparently. In terms of whether you have to check with a light box and a throat cloth. So again, the kashrut agencies find that to be an effective way of checking. It's not a halakha requirement.
So I can't come to Mark on the next thing because of another obligation, but I just want to know. Okay, so I wash a large amount of collard greens and things like that because they don't have a lot of wrinkles in them.
Right.
Collard greens.
Collard greens, yeah. Sure.
And so I don't find a lot of bugs in them.
Yeah.
But so I mean, I just wanted to know: do I need to have a throat cloth?
So
Because I shine a light. I look in the water. And
yeah.
think
Again, no. I mean,
Because CRC, these things.
all the kashrut agencies say to use a throat cloth and a light box. Okay, that's across the board.
Especially
All the
CRC.
major agencies.
CRC.
That's what they're saying. CRC, Star
But
K.
it's extra.
it's. I'm not saying it's bad.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that if you have another way of checking,
Okay.
then that's also
Okay.
sufficient. And especially if you're washing it well and all that's left are things that look like specks of dirt, there are reasons to not drive yourself crazy about
I
that.
found the third cloth to be more convenient.
Right.
Which I think is what their purpose is, that it's a convenience for some people.
Right. And so the truth of the matter is, like if I'm washing romaine lettuce, what's left in the water is not a lot, right? So I don't use a third cloth. I just, I'll check the water, and then I may check a few leaves just to double check. But if you say you're buying these mixed greens, right? Depending on how good they are, meaning sometimes they're a little bit past date or whatever, they can tend to break down. And when you go to check the water, you're seeing a lot of things floating around that you may not be able to tell the difference. And so there, a third cloth can come in handy because you're pouring the water basically through a colander onto the third cloth and then putting the third cloth on a light box that will make the bugs, say, easier to see. Not that it's required, it's not magnification, but it would be like, saying, well, can I check my produce in a dark room? Obviously not. You need good lighting, right? So this is the Kashrut's way of saying that this is a convenient method of being able to distinguish between specks of dirt and actual bugs that are floating in the water. My experience sometimes is that when I do that, it doesn't always help because anything that may look like a bug, it may be smushed based on the volume of water. If you're washing a lot and you have a full basin full of water and you're pouring it, so that bug is getting,
Can you pour? I mean, I don't know how big are these strip cloths. Like, can you really pour like a lot of, like a whole basin?
Well, it depends. At the JCC, it's probably, the cloth is
So you
probably,
use the strip- okay.
I don't know, half of this table or whatever,
Okay.
Yeah. Any, yeah.
So it's just sometimes a little bit awkward when the OU and the CRC and the Stark all say something weird, and then I bring a Shabbos dish to someone's house, and like I did the OU way, and then they make a comment about about something that CRC and the CRK happened, and then Moti Shabbos, I quickly go on my phone and I'm going through all the apps and I'm checking everything, and they all say something different. And I'm just like, so basically I did the. I mean, that's not true. I did what you said actually
Right.
to do on the chat. So
Right.
it was whatever.
It's
It's just like when you get in these situations, it's just like.
I would say,
I
it's interesting. The arena of bug checking, there's definitely, it's an arena where frumkeit happens, right? Where people are like, oh well, I want to be mockpit for this, or I want to be mockpit for that, and like I said,
Why would I be mockpit? Like, what is the?
What's the reason? That's more of a hashkafic. What's the reason to be mockpit about anything, right? That there's a certain approach that some people want to take by for instance, like I mentioned coconut sugar, right? There's just one guy on this chat who keeps rating about coconut sugar, but the point is that the only reason you're finding bugs is because you're going through this whole crazy system. Nobody else is saying to do that, right? So I would say my advice to you, it would be choose one agency that you're comfortable with. And as long as you're holding by that one agency, then listen, the Kashrut agencies all have a lot of information on their sites.
Can we have a synopsis?
The synopsis. So that's what's hard about this area of halacha is that the synopsis would be light box and third cloth, not a bad idea, but not required. If you're finding things in the water that you can't identify as a bug, no matter how hard you try, I don't think that you need to drive yourself crazy and say, I need to wash it another 100 times because I'm still finding, these specks of dirt in my water. Don't send me pictures of little bugs asking me if they're bugs, because if you can't tell, I definitely can't tell based on a picture. It happens to me sometimes. I'm like focusing in. I'm like, so I tell people, like, if I can't tell that's a bug, and if you can't tell so much that you're sending me a picture, then as far as I'm concerned, it's not a bug.
Especially if your iPhone can't pick up.
Right.
What if a lot of times when you wash it like the first time, there's just so much stuff there.
Right.
It's hard to tell what's
Right. So again, when you're checking, right? So
like earth or something.
if you're most of the Kashrut agencies, I think not all, the methodology is generally put your produce in one basin with the soap or vegetable wash or whatever, and then wash it in just plain water, right? Don't check the soapy water. The point is the soapy water is there to remove the bugs if they're there, right? So if you check the soapy water, then the point is you check the fresh water and then you see that your wash worked, right? So that's the other thing, and we could talk a little bit about this tomorrow, is that part of the washing procedures is establishing that the wash works. So for instance, at the JCC or in a lot of catering, right, where you're not just washing one box of lettuce, right? So you're doing an event for 300, 400 people, right? You're doing a Pesach hotel, whatever it is, you're talking a lot of lettuce. Is the mishkiach checking every single box and every single leaf? Not necessarily. And we'll learn tomorrow that there's these ideas of batch checking, and you're trying to establish that the wash is something that works, and therefore the question would be, when I wash something, am I trying to get to 100% bug-free lettuce? And this is a question that comes up all the time. Like, people come to the restaurant, they're like, it's a kosher restaurant, I get my salad and I find a bug in my salad. Is that a knock on the Kashrut agency? Not necessarily. Nobody's claiming, unless you're controlling the environment entirely, like, back in the day we had the gush katif lettuce or like things like that, where it's like greenhouse grown, controlled environment, and they're guaranteeing that there's no bugs coming from anywhere. But otherwise, you're not trying to get your produce to be 100% bug free. You're trying to get it to a point where there's no longer an obligation to check.